Hi, a huge welcome to Steve's Kitchen. We're going to start a new series on the basics of bread making, and I'm kicking it off with something a lot of you might think is a little complicated. It's a sourdough starter, but I think actually you might have some fun. And the reason I'm starting with this is it isn't actually that complicated, and it also will put you in touch with the process of bread making with looking at wild yeasts that are all around us. Now, throughout this series, I am going to be using some digital scales. I really advise that rather than using cup measurements, that you use weight measurements when using bread. Now, if you don't fully understand why, maybe I'll do a video about that at a later date, but I think most people are starting to understand that cups are not accurate and you just end up with dry or wet doughs. And never is that more important than when you're working with sourdough starters. Now, what is a sourdough starter? Well, you've seen yeast, you've seen dry yeast going into bread, and you may have used block yeast as well. Sourdough starters are natural yeast. They're all around us, they're on our skin, they're on flour, they're in the air. And what we're going to do is capture those in a flour water mixture. And over time, they're going to develop a beautiful, strong yeast that has a slight sour note to it, and it creates those wonderful sourdough breads. You're going to want a container. I'm going to show you the measurements. It's very simple steps. I'm going to do it a little bit different than some people. On the first stage of this, I'm going to let the yeast develop in a closed environment. I'll show you that in a moment. So let's get on and measure out our flour and water. Now, in order to capture wild yeast, we need to actually feed them, and they feed off these starches and proteins that are in flour. Now, unlike a lot of people, yeasts are not flour snobs, so you can pretty much use any flour you like. I like to start with a strong bread flour. I think it creates a great sourdough starter. You could add some whole grain flours in with that as well. So you can start with almost any amount of flour. And for those of you who want to know, I'm going to start with 125 grams. I'm going to measure it into a cup just to give you an idea. But as I say, cups vary from country to country, and depending on whether you can pack them in or not can make a lot of difference. So I've gone for a loosely packed cup there. I'm going to put the flour into a kilner jar or a mason jar. And you can see that's about 122. I am going to be pernickety, and I am going to put the little bit extra flour in to make it up to 125. Now, a common mistake would be to use the equal amount of water. We are going to use the equal amount of water, but by weight. And don't use water straight from the tap. That may have chlorine in, which could affect your yeast. So we're going to add 125 grams of mineral water. Now, sometimes it is quite nice to mix up a stone ground flour and a bread flour. If you decide to do a different flour, comment down below, let me know what you choose. Now, we're going to give that a mix together until we get a nice batter. Now, I could seal this, but the gases that build up in here could create pressure. So what I'm going to do is cover the top over with some plastic wrap. Many times when you start a yeast like this, you leave the lid open so the atmosphere can get around it. I found it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, and I want the water not to evaporate. So I'm popping this cellophane on the top there. And also, we are not going to touch or feed this for 48 hours. So you're just going to leave it on the side, keep an eye on it, and you'll start to see some activity probably within the first 12 to 24 hours. So you've patiently waited 48 hours, and in that time, hopefully the flour and the natural yeast within the flour have started to bubble like this one has here. Can you see all the activity on the surface? And it's a very loose, airy batter. So you can see, despite covering this with this little bit of plastic wrap, we've still developed a wonderful yeast and the starting of a beautiful sourdough starter. It is also important to get used to the smells of your sourdough. In this early stage, there's almost a sort of hopsy beer smell coming out of this, which is absolutely perfect. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of a brown scum on top. Don't worry about that, that's quite natural. The wild yeast that's in there now is super hungry. We're not actually going to be discarding any of the dough at this point, we're just going to be feeding it. Again, I'm using my scales. We're going for about half a cup, which should be about 60 grams, which is about 2.1 ounces. We'll add that flour over the top of our starter and now weigh out 60 grams, that's about 2 ounces again of water. Pour that in on top of the flour, and then I'm going to take my spoon and we give this batter a little mix through. Now, it's always good practice just to clean the sides down after you've finished. This time we're not actually going to be sealing in our sourdough. You can pop the lid on loosely, don't actually seal it down. You could cover it with a sieve or maybe even a little bit of cheesecloth. Now for the next 4 or 5 days, we're going to take care of this dough. We're going to feed it when we get up in the morning and before we go to bed at night, roughly every 12 hours. You don't have to beat yourself up about it. And in a day or so, the volume is going to get quite a bit more, so we're going to have to discard some, but I'll show you that when we do it. Now I'm going to take you through a feeding, but not every feeding. We fed this last night with equal flour and water by weight. That's 60 grams, about 2 ounces of flour, 60 grams, about 2 ounces of water. Mix it in, clean down the sides, and now I'm going to give this another feed. But today I'm going to take a little bit out. And the reason behind that are twofold. One, if you just keep feeding this, you're going to eventually have a yeast that will just overflow out of your jar. But secondly, also, we're actually wanting to grow yeast, not just spent flour. So we're going to be taking little bits of spent flour out each time. And you don't have to discard it completely. You could make pancakes with it. You could add it into a cake mixture. It's perfectly fine. But we're just going to take a little bit out today. Now, you'll see a little bit of brown liquid on the top. That's quite common, not to worry about that. The smell is still a little bit sour, a little bit yeasty. I'm going to take about half a cup of my sourdough mixture out of here. So I'm going to measure that out into half a cup. And like I say, you can discard this, turn it into lovely sourdough pancakes, pop it onto the compost, whatever you like. I'm going to measure out my flour. That's about 60 grams, 2 ounces. That's the feed for my wild yeast. And 60 grams of mineral water. Again, it's about 2 ounces. So you can see by weight the water is the same, but by volume it's not. Just as important as the flour, that goes in as well. And it's already starting to bubble in there. I'm going to give that a good mix through into a nice smooth batter. And I'm going to clean down the sides of my jar as I always do. And then this evening, I may discard a little bit more and feed it again. I'm going to keep doing that for the next 3 or 4 days until I start getting a lovely frothy culture. Now, I'm super pleased with the way this sourdough starter is going. It's almost all bubbled. When we fed it last night, it was down here. It's risen up, so there's heaps of activity in there. Just take a look at this. You can see all the bubbles and the activity on the top. If I break it open like that, you can see it's very light and airy. It's already starting to bubble up again. There's a nice sour note coming off of there. If you've been joining me on this, this is about 5 days in now from the first 24 hours plus 5 days. And I'm going to feed this now for the last time, and then we can use this sourdough starter to start baking. Now, to be honest, at this point, it hardly needs discarding, but I'll take a bit off because I fancy some sourdough pancakes this morning. I'm just going to pop maybe about half a cup into a bowl, separate like this. I've got my strong flour here, which I'm just going to use to feed the starter. And that was 60 grams of flour, so I'm going for the same in weight of water. Now that's a tiny little bit over, but it won't matter too much. Add the water, get the moisture levels right, and we'll give this a stir through. Now you can see that's knocked the batter back down to half its former volume, and that will increase to double its size probably within the next few hours. And if you're using this starter every day for baking, you can just keep replenishing and using. I hope you're following along with me because I can't wait to start using this in some recipes on my channel. Now, one more feed tomorrow and it'll be ready. And you do want to get used to the smell of your sourdough. This is just a little sour but very fresh smelling. Now, if you've decided to follow along, make your own sourdough with me, you'll be enjoying what we're making with this on the bread series of Steve's Kitchen. Join me next week. We're not doing sourdough next week, but we'll be starting this introduction to bread baking basics. So I will see you then. Share the love. Comments down below. Actually, I'd love to hear down below if you are making a sourdough starter so I can help you and we can see how it progresses. Be good. See you next time. Now, if you've joined me on the series about making a sourdough starter, and you've got your beautiful sourdough starter now, what are you going to do with it? Well, if you're baking regularly, just keep it on the side, feed it each day, make your breads. If you're only making sourdough every week or so, those of you that have been following along making the sourdough starter will be anxious to get on and make something with it. Now, this is looking beautiful and light and bubbly. It smells delicious, and we're going to use it, or we're going to let it help us make a sourdough baguette. So this is a no-knead baguette, very simple to make. The yeast is doing all the work. Let's get on and make it.